All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Patrick Hankinson. I'm a partner at Concrete Ventures. We're an Atlantic Canadian pre-seed fund focused on finding great ideas and founders looking to build massively scalable businesses here in Atlantic Canada. One of our core values here is to have an impact on the broader startup community outside of our portfolio, and pipeline development is very important to us, which is why we put on these webinars. Today, I'm excited to have Darren Gallop from Securicy, one of our own portfolio companies, here to talk about managing vendor security questionnaires that can make or break your enterprise sales efforts. In fact, one of the reasons Securicy was started was because Darren had lost a significant deal at his last startup because of security and compliance issues. Feel free to ask any questions with the Q&A feature during the webinar, and if Darren has time, he'll answer them. You can also ask them through the chat feature as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to Darren.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Patrick. Great to meet everybody. Yeah, I've got the Q&A window open, and in case I'm going through something and somebody doesn't understand something or have a question, certainly drop it in there. If it's sort of off topic or whatnot of what I'm chatting about, I'll make sure to try to address it in the end if we have time, for sure. Yeah, so my name is Darren Gallop, CEO and co-founder of Securicy. I've been an entrepreneur since I was in my early 20s, now in my crouching on my late 40s. Started my career in the music industry, so kind of an interesting journey. Never would have expected that I'd be the CEO of a cybersecurity and privacy compliance company. I don't know if I necessarily even would have known what all those words would have meant if somebody had asked me that in my early 20s. So yeah, from the music industry, I did my first startup in 2008, ran that for 10 years. It was more of a boutique sort of lifestyle SaaS business that serviced a lot of the major music festivals around the world, things like Coachella, Burning Man, Halifax Pop Explosion, Just for Laughs Festival, stuff like that. And we sold that company in 2018. And so how did I get from that world to Security? We were selling to small festivals like Halifax Pop Explosion, ECMA, stuff like that in our early days. And then at one point we sort of broke into the bigger world of festivals. We landed at Coachella, which turned into starting to do a lot more business with AEG, which then turned into starting to do Live Nation gigs and gigs for Disney and stuff like that. We kind of had this really lame, naive statement when people asked us about, how safe was their data and how safe is the system, where we'd say, oh, we use state-of-the-art security similar to what the banks use, which, doesn't really say a lot. But that was enough early on when people weren't very aware of sort of vendor risks, or there weren't really, daily headlines of breaches, and there weren't a whole bunch of privacy regulations like GDPR and big fat fines and stuff like that associated with us, with all that. And so we got by with sort of that bullshit answer for a good chunk of time. And then I think it's about 2014, 2015, we had Live Nation come to us, really big deal, would have increased our ARR by about 15% in one deal, would have given us 20 of the major music festivals in the UK. And they had a big security questionnaire for us. We did our best to answer it, and we kind of thought we kind of got a little cocky, I think, with sort of our ability to be able to dance around stuff and react in the moment to all of the curveballs that get thrown at you in the startup world. And the auditors for Live Nation on the other end of the line that were receiving our answers were seasoned veterans and saw through our bullshit pretty quickly. So we ended up in a call with them, where the call was, we thought was an opportunity for us to charismatically navigate the situation favorably. It was technically for them an opportunity for them to actually figure out how much of what we said in our questionnaire was real versus theoretical, and how much we actually were able and equipped to look after their data at the level that they expected. We failed miserably and lost the deal and never got an opportunity to present to that customer again. We had a similar scenarios happen quite frequently after that. We started to see this as a regular occurrence as we were kind of moving up market and getting to more sophisticated customers. So that really, that was a wake up moment. And as the CEO, it became like our biggest obstacle. And I put a lot of effort into building out a security program, figuring out what privacy regulations we need to start thinking about the data we store and how we protect that data and how we present that and articulate that to the customer. Took me about a year to get a really good sense of it. We then actually saw it as a selling opportunity because we were having these newer startups coming into our market with lower price points and shinier, flashier looking tools, and in an effort to win and close against these prettier, cheaper solutions. We took that step of really saying, hey, well, we're the solution if you actually care about your data and want the type of protections. And we leveraged that. A couple of us got certifications in security. We created a really awesome report card thing that we could share with customers, just really instill confidence and trust. And that was what got me to going like, wow, everybody needs this. And when I did my CISSP certification, I posted on LinkedIn, and a bunch of my friends who were CTOs and CEOs of tech companies were like, hey man, do you have 10 minutes? Like, we're getting hammered with security questionnaires. We don't have a clue what we're doing. It became really clear to me that this was the future of how you need to be positioned and how you need to operate in order to sell. So that's how I got from playing drums and managing bands and producing records to doing what I'm doing now. So just gonna walk through. Okay, so 3 reasons to invest in security. So the first one's, the security industry talks a lot about keeping customer data safe and avoiding fines. And these are really true things. You definitely don't want to be the person or the entity that's responsible for a major data breach or losing a bunch of customer data. And you probably don't want to get a big GDPR fine. But let's think about it through the lens of a startup for a minute instead of how the industry and how cybersecurity talks about what your risks are. We all know in a startup, especially an earlier stage startup, that really our biggest risks are probably not getting a fine because, well, how can you take fines? How can you pay a fine when you don't have that much money or money at all? So, our biggest risks are generally running out of money before we can get enough sales to either pay people or raise our next round of capital. So generally when we do a risk assessment for a startup, like, what's keeping you up at night? It's generally that. It's like, I got payroll and I got about 9 weeks or 3 months or 8 months or whatever that number is. You're worried about like closing deals, land grab before your competitors get, like, these are the real risks that honestly at the end of the day are more likely to differentiate your position and the success for you and your business than, say, getting a GDPR fine. Really small company that nobody's ever heard of, probably not getting a GDPR fine. So the real reason that startups need to think about security is it's all about growth and building your company. And so there's a couple of things to think about in there. When I say growth, I'm talking about your ability to sell primarily. And we all know that when we're talking to investors, more than anything, traction, sales, retention, these are the metrics that you're really being sort of gauged upon, amongst others, but those are obviously very critical ones. So let's talk just for a second about like what's going on in the security landscape out there, and this is really important. So, here's a couple of big fines, big enterprises. We don't sell to enterprises. We don't help Morgan Stanley or Ticketmaster secure themselves. That's a whole other can of worms. But what's interesting when we look at a lot of these fines that have happened, a lot of the breaches that have happened, there's a real sense of, there's a real observation that a lot of this comes from the vendors, right? The big Target breach was the same thing. Equifax's breach. There's a lot of breaches are happening, and it's actually coming from they haven't done their due diligence to make sure that the vendor they've chosen, and it's a SaaS company that has an innovative product that's going to give them a competitive edge. And they're just simply messed up to doing proper due diligence to make sure that vendor wasn't going to be a major error for them. And so what we see is companies out there all the time, and healthcare is one example, but it's not the only example out there. And you're seeing, and you're probably in your businesses hearing things. If you're in the healthcare business, you're hearing about HIPAA, you're hearing about TRAs, threat risk assessments, that your customers probably want to see if they're in Canada, or you're hearing about PIPEDA from the Canadian perspective. If you're selling If you're selling to the government in the US, you're probably hearing about NIST. If you're selling to Europe, you're probably hearing about ISO standards, GDPR, certainly if there's any privacy information, any personal information, you're probably hearing about SOC 2 audits. So there's a lot. This is really just sort of scraping the top of what's happening. There's a bunch of other regulations and requirements that are going on out there. Governments are reacting, essentially putting pressure on organizations to do better at looking after the data and the privacy of their citizens. So security. So what's happening now is we're seeing that this is something that's really feared at the enterprise level. Having these breaches is highly feared. And the enterprise level, you're not worried about running out of money. Generally, you're not worried about your next raise per se. You're more protection. You're thinking about more protecting your image, protecting your brand, maintaining your growth, and your position in a public market. So the last thing you want is a big headline about major breaches, about failure to look after customer data, things like that. So, with all of the stats that have come out in the last couple of years around how many vendor related breaches have had these effects, it's really forced these enterprises to put a lot more emphasis and put a lot more energy into the due diligence process that they're going to do on any startup, any small, medium-sized business, any vendor in the supply chain, essentially. And that creates a downstream effect for a startup. If you're a startup now, there's a whole other pillar to your sales process that you need to learn, build for, and factor in. And if you fail to do that, you will fail to close the deal. So let's think about that for a second. I want to talk a little bit about a vendor security questionnaire. I'm assuming any of you guys that are on this call, providing you're in market, even at proof of concept level, if you're selling to government or you're selling to a larger enterprise, I'm assuming that you would have received some sort of what we would call vendor due diligence, which would be your customer doing something to try to figure out or get a sense of your compliance or your risk rating, whether that's asking for an attestation or report, like something like a SOC 2 or an ISO cert, or asking for any sort of third-party assessment, maybe a pen test, or maybe sending a security questionnaire with a bunch of questions about what you're doing from a data protection perspective and how you're looking after their data, maybe even a phone call or sort of Zoom call to sort of walk through your answers. So this is what we're seeing pretty commonly. What I saw back in my last startup in 2014, 2015, when we seen these questionnaires and this due diligence process begin, we're now seeing it happen a lot more aggressively, a lot more often, and a much deeper view. It used to be almost feel like it was sort of like a check the box, put a piece of paper in the file. So the guy doing the due diligence or the gal doing the due diligence doesn't get in trouble if they miss something. They just, oh, look, I did what I was supposed to do. It's getting deeper now. It's getting really into assessing risk and scoring the organization from a risk perspective. And then, the decision factor is, okay, what's your product? What's your pricing? And also, what is the risk that this organization or working with this third party introduces into our risk portfolio or our risk posture? And is the value proposition that's being provided by the company, by the startup in most cases, is that worth this additional risk level that's being introduced in the business? What we've seen traditionally is security questionnaires come at the end. So let's say, for example, you're selling to the marketing department of an enterprise. What we've seen traditionally is you go through all this process, and then at the very last stage, it would be the piece that you do, and you'd have to pass that, and that would give you a little bit of lenience because they've already made quite a sizable investment in scrutinizing and demoing and talking with you, having demos of the product, maybe some negotiation over various contract points or service pricing, etc. So there was a real internal desire to win. Now what we're seeing is this process is often now starting at the onset. So they'll even, before you even get into that, once they've narrowed it down to say 3 or 4 vendors for a potential engagement, engagement, we're seeing that security vetting happen, at least at a high level sort of perspective, right out of the gate before any substantial investment in further researching or exploring going with the vendor. So that's starting to happen as a precursor, and is factored into, hey, if you don't meet this requirement, then we're just going to move you from the race, so we don't bother wasting anybody's time. The first thing when you get a security questionnaire, so this is before I get into, I'm going to get into the specifics of sort of how you think about security questionnaires and give you some thought on how you can appropriately answer them. But the first thing I will say is that there's not really a great way to prepare for a security questionnaire if you have absolutely no security program or privacy program in your business, because essentially what it is it's going to be a bunch of questions that are designed to judge and assess what your security maturity essentially is in the business. So if you have no policies, no procedures, you've never done a risk assessment, you've never done a pen test, you don't have any of these sort of formalities in the business, then when you get that security questionnaire, you're in a really bad position, because you're going to have two options. One of them is just lie, which I'll get into that and how that works against you in a few minutes. You're either going to have to be truthful or untruthful. The untruthful route is where you answer the favorable question, like, do you do this thing? Yes, absolutely. You don't do it, but hey, if they ask us for it, we'll do it that day, kind of thing. There's that's an approach. I don't recommend it. It can cause a lot of problems. But if you're looking to actually answer it the right way, which is not lying, it's going to be really hard to do that unless you've done some stuff. So, I would give some thought to this. I wouldn't wait till you get a security questionnaire. In fact, the reality is that they're generally not that unique one from the other. The wording or the process or the tool they use to send the questionnaire may be individual to the company, but generally speaking, the questions are going to be the same. They may be worded differently, but they're going to be looking for the same things. And those things are going to be based off the common body of knowledge, which is a word or term that basically means like what security people generally are doing. What are the best practices out there? If you're a cloud app, if you're a web-based application or a mobile app that communicates with a server environment in say AWS, then there's a whole bunch of like common best practices. The vendors themselves, like AWS, have best practices. There's best practices for different framework standards, whatnot. So, that is one thing. The other thing they're going to do is they're probably going to base it also on privacy regulations, which these days GDPR is kind of like the main privacy regulation in the world. It's really created a leadership piece, and in terms of leadership globally, in which we're seeing other jurisdictions around the world follow that lead that GDPR is. So we see a lot of GDPR language in these questionnaires when there's privacy data involved. And they probably follow some internal standard or framework, like something like an ISO 27001 or a NIST 800 series or a CIS standard. So again, a lot of very similar questions that are going to be answered. Interesting question coming in from Aman. And it's, how can one navigate in the absence of a security questionnaire? So I'm assuming it's a great question, actually. I'm assuming you're saying like you don't get the security questionnaire, but people are still curious, and that is a great point. One of the things we always recommend our customers to do when we work with startups from a security and privacy perspective is we generally encourage you not to wait for a security questionnaire. So the first thing, as soon as you build a security program in your business and you actually have something now this is a sales element. This is like, hey, we've got a premium class security program, and that's a value proposition to your company. I would include some summary details about that in your sales deck or your sales data. I would also have a more detailed security and privacy report that really articulates and offers you the opportunity to showcase the sophistication of your business. It will go a lot to help the sales process when people are going through, and the last thing the marketing department of any enterprise wants to do is burn months doing due diligence and figuring out which vendor they want to work with, to find out that the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, or the Governance and Risk Officer doesn't give the thumbs up, and now they're stuck like, oh shit, I got to go back to the drawing board, which is exactly what I did in my last company to Disney. They were pissed. They were not happy with the security team for failing us. They weren't happy with us for not passing. And like in their mind, they were like, can we get this crap done so we can onboard? So, it's nobody wants that. So like, yeah, if you're, whether you get security questionnaires or not, having a really good articulation and showcase your security posture once you have one that's worthy of showcasing is going to be very helpful in the sales process. And it's also going to reduce the likelihood that you're going to have to do these calls or get these questionnaires. If you have a really comprehensive security report that impresses the security officer at the enterprise or government organization you're selling to, and they get that, and it's in fact answering their questions, and it's giving them the details they need to score you from a risk perspective, then there's a high likelihood that you're not even going to get that questionnaire, which means now you're not going to have to answer a 200 question questionnaire. So really, highly recommend that, whether there's a questionnaire or not, is having that little bit of a tidbit of showcaseable sort of sales collateral about what you comply with, or some wording or positioning around your security and privacy posture, and then something in greater detail that you can share, preemptively when you're getting into that later stage in the sales cycle and approaching that due diligence. And I'll also just mention, before I dive into the security questionnaire, and Patrick and Corey and I were chatting about this earlier, we actually have a customer that's in the process of, we have two different situations. One of them is in the process of closing a fairly sizable Series B round with a sophisticated tier one investor. And those types of investors, what we're seeing as a trend, they're actually considering your security posture as part of their investment thesis. So whether it be, make sure that the risk is reasonable here, that we're not investing in a train wreck, and then also getting an understanding of what types of corrections may need to be done for the business to move through with their commercialization plan. And generally, what they look for a lot of the times is actually, especially once you've been around for a couple of years, is what we call technical security debt. What I mean by that is if you have developers building products and nobody's thinking about privacy, nobody's thinking about security, there's no training that those developers have, or maybe it's the CEO doesn't give a shit about security and they're just like, features, timelines, move. If you go and you just kind of couple of years and thousands of lines of code being built without any security by design or privacy by design considered into the equation, you're going to end up in a situation where, highly likely situation where you're going to have a bunch of technical debt around that security. And that's going to mean going in and refactoring, updating libraries, doing a lot of stuff, maybe even doing things over. If they were designed in haste and privacy and security was completely absent from it, you're going to end up with some issues there. And we have another customer that's in an acquisition process, and they're spending quite a bit of money in the acquisition to assess, do a big deep analysis on the code base, and what they're looking for primarily is security. They're running security tests. They're running different types of tests to validate, like, what is the bar? Like, is this code base meet the requirements of our organization? Because when you're a startup and you're 20 or 30 people, you're not as likely to get fined necessarily, because you don't really have much money likely that you can pay the fine. But once that startup is now a subsidiary of Disney or a subsidiary of Live Nation or some larger entity, all of a sudden the exposure is much larger, right? So usually these organizations want to make sure they have great clarity around the risk, and that they want to make sure that they can make the corrections to that risk profile before they announce that this is now part of whatever major organization is acquiring you. So that's that. And I do see a question many times. It's a battle between business interests. Any learnings that can be shared from failures and success during communication? Yeah, communication, I'm assuming you mean sort of communication like with your customers, or you're talking more internally when you're talking about communication in the business in terms of meeting security objectives. both are very important things. Internally, where we see a lot of smaller businesses struggle is actually in their inability to communicate security or privacy as a priority. And generally, what we see in most companies that are struggling to actually get their shit together and get things to where they need to be, it's usually because the founders and or the CEO doesn't prioritize it and doesn't practice it in their own right. So kind of sees it as like a, checking things off versus actually, giving it any type of air in the room. So, if the CEO, if the founders of an organization don't care about security, well, it's highly unlikely that anyone else is going to, so that's certainly from a communication perspective, there needs to be a little bit of air in the room, and there needs to be some prioritization around it. And I'll get into that a little bit as we go through. So yeah, what does a security questionnaire typically cover? And as I said earlier, generally they all cover similar things. You will notice various unique trends depending on your industry. Like if you're selling to government, for example, you're going to hear some different acronyms in there. If you're selling to Europe, you're going to hear a lot of stuff that's going to come from the GDPR language. If you're in healthcare, you're going to hear a lot from the HIPAA and protected healthcare information, stuff like that. But aside from the acronyms, a lot of the stuff is not drastically different. So luckily, the good news is most of the world generally agrees on most practices, although there are some areas of difference there. But for the most part, there's a lot of overlap. So as a SaaS, application security is generally a pretty high level of importance. And when we talk about security, it's the industry terms that are used in security is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And that may differ. Which of those are important in your business will differ. If like for my last business, we integrated with ticketing platforms and passes for access for high profile people at events. So if the system went down for 20 minutes, that was a huge problem. It meant that there was a lot of VIP people that were highly annoyed and unable to enter the grounds of a festival that they just commuted halfway around the world to. So that's an example of availability being an issue. The confidentiality would be protection against data breaches. Companies that if they're looking at, hey, what's the risk to us by using you as a SaaS? Is it what happens if the data is breached? Confidentiality. What happens if the data is incorrect or the reports or modules don't spit back the right numbers? That's an integrity issue. So if you're selling banking software, investment software, that's probably going to be a bit of an issue if you're reporting false returns and stuff like that accidentally because of a data integrity problem. Availability would be the application. What happens if it goes down? What's is a minute a problem? Is 5 minutes a problem? Like what's the threshold here? Before this becomes a major sort of business changing event. So application security is a big one for a SaaS. Security and privacy policy. So they generally want to see that you have a documented formal security program that's real, that actually was written with some level of thoughtfulness to it, not just downloaded some crap off of some website and take the policies and actual things that if they were to ask you questions in a call about your policies, you wouldn't be like, yeah, we kind of, because you would be actually doing them because it's real and because that, because it's, that when I say security and privacy policies, I don't just mean pieces of paper. I mean, there's actual policies and procedures in the business that are followed. IT infrastructure for startups, that's mostly how you manage your AWS or your Google Cloud or Azure or whatever you're hosted on. So you're not just turning it on and then just putting an app on there and hoping for the best. That there's actual structure and thought. And good news, there's a lot of great features. It's a lot easier to do that now than it was when I built my first SaaS, where you kind of had to figure all this shit out by yourself. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in those platforms for the most part to fast track that. They want to understand your data handling and management practices. Physical security, if you have an office, it becomes less important a lot of times in SaaS. So it's one of the ones that can often be NA, not applicable. Incident response plans are big these days. A lot of times SaaS companies have incidents and they fail to respond or even fail to notify or even fail to know what happened. So there's a lot of push lately. We even see especially since COVID, because really the COVID, when it first hit and everybody was like panic and businesses were closing their doors and people were going home that weren't necessarily equipped to work from home, essentially, there was a lot of like really bad mismanagement of that incident and lack of preparedness. So we even see some organizations want to see that you have something like a pandemic preparedness or pandemic response plan or stuff like that in your incident response plan. A lot of emphasis there. Security philosophy. So like, what's your organization's perspective on it? That's usually something they want to know. A lot of data has come back to the cybersecurity world about how, again, as I was saying before, if the CEO doesn't give a shit, then the company doesn't give a shit. And therefore, like, it just trickles down. You're going to do the minimal to close deals all the time, or even less than that minimal, if the philosophy is that there really isn't one, or there's not really much of a priority. It's amazing the impact of just having senior management say, hey, this is an important thing. We're going to track it. We expect you all to work in this way. And, once you kind of get over that initial hump of understanding what that means, once you're doing it, like I can say as a startup that is operating above and beyond our security and privacy requirements, and it doesn't slow us down, or if it does, it's such a small amount because it's so baked into our processes. It's done properly, it's done real. And then therefore, because of that, when somebody wants to get on the phone and ask us questions, I don't need documents to answer them. I know this stuff because we live and breathe it. Like, we operate this way, right? So it just makes it so easy for us to instill confidence in a customer. Access control. Startups are horrible at this. Like, everybody, as soon as you sign up, like, you just get access to everything. And then like, no matter what your job is, often people have access to almost everything. And so, that's something that the enterprise world has learned is a bad practice that startups do. So it seems to be one that they go into and actually look into quite diligently. And then training, training mostly for your staff and people that are servicing the customers, making sure that there's some level of training happening there and people know about security and privacy and how they handle data. So those are like some of the big ones. There's some other areas, but those are the areas that we see the majority of questions asked. We've analyzed several hundred security questionnaires over the last year, and sort of watching the trends of where people are going, where they're really focusing, and that's some of the findings that we had there. So 5 tips for reducing time needed to answer questionnaires. Really, the thing I always say to people, like, read the whole thing and make sure you understand it right out of the gate. And if you don't, find out the answer. What that means is really looking at it, figuring out what it is. If it's, a lot of times it's really hard to understand, because what happens in enterprises, they write questionnaires. So they write one questionnaire as a template, and then they send that to every vendor. So like, if you're a paper shredding company, if you had a paper shredding company, a office cleaning company, a SaaS platform, and a hosting provider, and a consultant all going to do a contract with Disney, you're probably all getting the same questionnaire. So there's going to be questions in there that are not applicable, or that you don't understand what they mean, right? You might get a bunch of questions around your firewall and your network, and you're like, I don't have a network, or so there's a lot of clarification. And so what I generally recommend a customer do right away is to read it. And when it's not clear, go back to the person who sent you the questionnaire with detailed questions, like, is this applicable? What do you mean by this section? We don't have an office. Whatever it is that you don't understand, going back and getting clarity on that right away. Don't wait. The time is ticking, right? One of the things that when we interviewed enterprise auditors that concerns them is when they look at a sales process where your team is really responsive and all, like the sales and pricing and all this process of closing the deal, then they send you the security questionnaire, and then it's like crickets for a week because no one knows what the hell to do with this thing. Like, that's a sign. That's a bad sign. It's basically like, oh, they're not ready for this one. They didn't expect this. They didn't preempt this. They're not in a position where they can do that. So really break it down, understand what is being asked, and put it in context of the risk. And what I mean by that is, like, think about, what are they going to use you for? What data is going to be processed? What is the risk to their business from a confidentiality, integrity, and availability perspective? And keep that in mind. If you're low risk, so let's say you have an app that doesn't really have any PII, there's no personal information, it could go down for a day, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Like, if it's really simple and and the risk to that customer is not high, it's likely that the process they put you through won't be as diligent, because often these companies, these risk folks are prioritizing their effort where the greatest risk is. So the first thing they'll do is, what are these guys doing for us, right? If it's like, oh, they're going to have 20 million records of our customer with PII and PHI and people all over the globe. Okay, whoa, they're going to bring in, like, they're bringing in a privacy lawyer. They're bringing in, you're going to be answering to a panel, not just one risk person. I've seen our customers have to go into calls where there's 5 or 6 people from the enterprise organization that are all representing various different risk categories in the business. One of them might be looking at the legal privacy risk of GDPR. Another one might be focused on HIPAA and healthcare data compliance globally. The other one might be looking at application security. So you're going to get varying degrees there. So understand the questions. Don't try to take a crack. See people like answering these like they think they need to have an answer for every question. You may not. And like, read the question. A lot of the times what we see is a single question can actually be several questions. And here's an example. Is there a network policy that has been approved by management, communicated to appropriate constituents, and an owner and has an owner to maintain and review the policy? So we've copied and pasted this out of a questionnaire. We see this question as a early question in the first top 10 of the questions asked in almost every questionnaire. But if you look at the question, there's a couple of things. First question, is there actually a policy? So have you drafted, do you have a policy? And when you say yes, generally the next thing is, and please share us the policy. So then you're expected to share the policy. Approved by management. So they want to make sure that, the sales guy didn't just download this off the SANS website and find all, replace template with name of startup, send to customer. They want to make sure that there's a formal process where management approves it. They want to make sure communicate it. So communicate it means that, like, they should be able to they could interview any employee in your company and say, hey, what's your guys' policy on multi-factor authentication? And they wouldn't be, well, I think we've got, no, it'd be like, oh, our policy is like, we're not allowed to do anything unless it's MFA. And in fact, it's actually, enforced on our SSO provider, which is Google. And that's like, okay, that means it's communicated. People are doing it. It's real. You're not doing security theater, which unfortunately, so many startups have been bullshitting their way through this for the last 5 years that now all of the wise and experienced vendor assessors that work for enterprise and government, as soon as they know you're a startup and you're venture back, they're like, okay, it's not these guys can answer questions, but what we need to do is read between the lines and find out, is it real or not? An owner, so somebody actually has responsibility to the policy and they maintain it. So as the business grows, as products change, as like a management layer grows into the business, as they bring on bigger financiers and things like that, is the policy just there on the shelf collecting dust? So that's an example. Like, this question has multiple questions within it. So when you do a questionnaire, like I said before, if you don't have any of this stuff in place, it's gonna be really hard to answer a questionnaire. Let's say you have some of this stuff in place. You can showcase what you have. You can identify the gaps. And you're really, what you can do when you go through the process, when you answer the questions, your vendor's going to go through the gaps. If there's things you answer that they don't like, they're going to come back and ask you to talk through it. And often what they'll do, and we've seen this a lot with our customers, where they say, okay, we're happy with X, Y, and Z. We're not comfortable moving forward with the following discoveries. Can we agree on a remediation timeline? If you're lucky enough to have that, in my first experience with Disney, we didn't have that because the timeline was like next week they needed to onboard us, because it was like highly tied to the festival season, and it was really, really sort of seasonal. And if it didn't start in a couple of weeks, there was no point. So we were sort of helpless. But sometimes you'll get the ability to build a remediation plan and and then maybe represent to that customer in 6 weeks. Not a spot you want to be at, though, because if there's other competitors in your space and they're ready to go and your customer is excited to move forward, then yeah, you want to be able to move forward. You don't want to jeopardize this while you're sort of scrimmaging around in the background, trying to put together the security program that you should have already had. Another thing too, just to mention, is the longer you wait, the harder it is. So if you instill security by design and privacy by design early, because you have very little going on, there's very little to add it to. And if it gets baked into your culture and articulate and communicate it from the onset, then it's going to be something that you're going to onboard new employees into. It's going to be thought out as you build more products. It's going to be part of the thought process in your code testing and how you deliver a product and how you build product, versus if you wait and wait and wait, you're just going to have backlog and backlog. I've seen some companies, one of the things we'll do is, when we sign up a new customer, first thing we'll do is do a vulnerability scan. So we'll do an external and internal scan, and it gives us kind of a sense like how diligent are they for most things. Often we'll see like 15, 20 vulnerabilities, of which half of them are critical. And all of these things require the developers to go in and fix them. But, the challenge is it never gets easy as a startup. Like when you have no customers, like in some ways it's easier because you don't have the pressures of commitments you've made to 20 different customers. So you get a situation where you got a customer about to close the biggest deal of their life. They need to pass a certain audit, but they don't have they have all this technical debt, but at the same time, they have all these commitments they've made on the deals they've just closed. So now it's really, really challenging to get these components in. So go through, look at what's there, figure out if there's a timeline to get through it. And then as you answer questions, this becomes your library of questions. And what we often do when we do a new engagement is we ask them for all their questionnaires. Send us everything. I don't care if you bullshit on it. I want to see. And then we sit down and, when we do our analysis, we'll try to figure out which of these answers are just favorable answers versus real answers. We'll use that. And then we'll build a knowledge base. So then when you get future questionnaires, you can actually have somebody on a more administrative level versus your CTO or your COO or CEO or somebody like that that's obviously pretty critical and very busy. You can turn this into an administrative exercise where 90% of these can be a copy paste exercise. And in fact, there's now tools out there that will actually automate that. So once you've built a posture and you have that knowledge base, we have a tool that we bolt onto our platform that pulls data from our platform, answers about 90% of a security questionnaire. Now, you still want to go through and read it, make sure the robot didn't misunderstand anything. But that's a big way that we're able to help with that process. And that's sort of the trend in the industry is really getting that together. But again, none of this can happen if you're not doing the stuff, because it's a bunch of questions about doing the stuff, right? So another thing that's helpful and is adopting a framework or a standard or have some way of benchmarking yourself. Usually your industry and your customers will do this for you. And so there are a couple of examples there that are on the screen. And a lot of times nowadays, it does make sense to follow more than one. So like a typical engagement we'll do with a startup now, we'll have at least one privacy regulation because they have some form of PII in their app or their application. So they need to comply with the privacy requirements. We usually leverage a security standard. If they're highly privacy focused, ISO 27000 or 27001 is usually the one that we'll go with, unless they're selling to government, in which case it would be NIST. There's a lot of overlap between the two, so these aren't really, these don't change the trajectory substantially, but just the ability to demonstrate to your customer that you are benchmarking against something versus you just kind of came up with all your own stuff. You're benchmarking against something they likely know and they likely are benchmarking themselves against. So it just facilitates the communication to have that. And most of our engagements are at least 2, if not 3 or 4 different standards and privacy regulations that are basically considered in that process. And it also makes reporting a lot easier, because then you can report a percentage of compliance against a standard, and it gives you guys a platform. So when you're talking to these sophisticated security auditors, you're able to speak some familiar language, which facilitates the process a lot. And so the big thing is really thinking about this, and this is where startups fail a lot. We've seen over the last 2 years, a lot of startups will come in with their hair on fire because they have a big deal. they'll do a lot of work in a very short period of time to improve their security posture, to meet the requirements of the deal. And then it's like they've crossed the finish line, and then it's like back to all the old habits. And it's almost like, when you kind of going and saying, oh shit, I ate a bunch of, I drank a bunch of beer and ate a lot of pizza all winter, and it's going to be, I'm going to lose 20 or 30 pounds and get buff for the summer. And then like, you go to the gym, you get, you do all this work, but you can't, if you stop and go back to the old habits, you end up in the same position. And that's essentially what we see a lot in startups. We have customers that will come in, do like a major sprint, get a whole bunch of stuff in place, get to a really good position. Then they'll let that fade down. And then they'll be in another situation where somebody's coming in with a greater level of diligence looking at their company. And then they've got to go back. They don't know where they're at because they haven't done anything in 6 months. They've really just kind of thought about it like they got their little trophy and they got their accomplishment and they moved on. It really needs to be built in. It needs to be design and planning, implementation, validation, attestation, and it's cyclical. It needs to be just baked in there. Like it should be part of the KPI. There should be some high level key KPIs that ensure that you're not letting it slip. And there should be some assignment or responsibility there, and the expectation that, the board's the CEO, at least, if not a board, is going to look at that. And if you're slipping in that category, they're going to see that as a problem. And we're seeing that more common on the board level as well. So think about this not as like, I'm going to do this thing and then I'm done. Think about like there's a little bit of a front heavy load to get there. But once you're there, you really do need to maintain that, and you need to have the tools and the air in the room, and it needs to be on the list of things that the board or the CEO is expecting the company to perform under. So just as a quick wrap up, and then we can use the remaining time for any questions. Keep it simple. Answer only what was asked. I see people like going on these like, do you have, it was like, do you have a application security testing regime? And then somebody goes, no, we don't need one. We use AWS. And it's, of course, wrong answer, but that wasn't the question. Keep it simple. Don't lie or overstate. What we've seen enterprises doing very commonly now, because of the trend of startups lying, is they'll usually also include a security addendum. So on top of answering the security questionnaire and the risk assessment being done on you as a vendor, you're also going to have an addendum or a section of your contract that's going to basically agreeing upon your minimal security requirements. This happens in almost every enterprise deal now. So not only are you answering the questions, but you're technically exposing yourself, your business, and yourself as a business leader and owner. There have been cases where the FTC has actually fined the founders of companies that have blatantly lied on security commitments and have failed in their like basic due diligence that in a way that has resulted in a breach. The company is not in a position to pay the fine per se. They've gone after the executives directly that have participated to prove, did you know that you signed this document? Did you also know that you guys weren't doing all kinds of stuff you just don't want to deal with? So don't lie, don't overstate. Having a security team to help share some of the responsibilities, it's really hard to have this be on one person. Take your time, communicate. Like I say, I hate when I see customers feel like this is a test they have to pass or fail and that they're not allowed to ask questions. Ask questions, make sure the questions are for you, make sure you understand them. So that's my presentation for today. I do see there's a question in the Q&A here. General Q, at an early stage startup, less than 5 people, normally who should assume responsibility and how can they outsource efforts? Yeah, so what I would say to that is it does depend on your business. Like security, usually you've got like some governance components, you have human resource components, like things people do, you have your technical components. So certainly your CTO or your lead developer, whoever's looking after your application building, you're going to want to have that person involved. At that stage, having the CEO involved is going to be critical. Whoever is managing and setting up and dealing with your AWS instance or whatever cloud hosting provider you're managed, That's really critical. Yeah, and you may have others involved as well, depending on the problem is it's hard to answer the question because the depth of your security scope is going to be dependent on how risky of a vendor you are to your customers. So and the type of data store, the where you integrate into their world, those things are going to factor. Also, the complexity of your products and services are going to be factored into there. Somebody asked about have we ever worked with clients that are doing blockchain technologies? Absolutely, we have. I don't know the percentage, but certainly a lot of them. How do you recommend a small startup with minimal security experience to go about this? Learn on their own, bring in consultants, Securicy. Yeah, so we have a free version of our platform right now that gives you some governance baselines. There's also tons, and that includes awareness training as well for your staff. So that's some good stuff. There's tons of, we have a blog as well. We put out how-to guides, usually every 2 or 3 weeks on something. So, everything we do or build or write is highly startup focused. So, a lot of our companies are early stage companies. We have a entry level sort of startup package that's fairly affordable. We've seen a lot of cases of companies in Atlantic Canada accessing a COA or other types of provincial based funding as well. Incorporating that into sort of their go-to-market or export strategies. Because if you're going to go into the U.S. and sell to enterprise, for example, or sell to the U.S. government or something like that, this is a requirement. So there's certainly some room to get help there. We have basically 2 ways we work with our customers. We have the DIY approach where you pay a small fee to access the tool, which writes the policies, gives you the controls, gives you the project, the guidance, some of the integration tools to monitor and measure once you got stuff in place. That's kind of like, here's the guide, here's the details, you go ahead and do this on your own. We also work with a lot of startups in a more sort of tech-enabled service or sort of model where we have a project manager assigned to a customer and there's access to some expertise in the team. So we do have that. And I find like I think the challenge with a lot of startups is you're wearing a lot of hats, and sometimes it's just really hard to add another hat, especially if that hat requires a lot of learning to it. And the problem with generic security education, and this is kind of how I went about it, is like a lot of stuff out there is written for enterprise. And some of it translates, but a lot of it doesn't translate well. So we've seen a lot of cases where people have burned a lot of time doing things that aren't necessarily well aligned with what a sophisticated risk assessor is going to look at in their business or where their actual risk is as a startup. We've seen companies go through like all kinds of network security stuff in their office. And it's like, you could have done none of this. You could have just there's a whole other way you could have done this that would have saved a bunch of time. And really, you should be focusing your energy on the areas where your risk is in your business, but also where your risk is relevant to your customer's business. Because that's what you're talking to. Like at the end of the day, like when they ask for a SOC 2 or they ask to talk to you about your security, they ask for a security questionnaire, security report. At the end of the day, what they're really asking you is they're coming in and going, we want to understand what our risk and exposure is, and have you put appropriate measures in place in your business that we can be confident are going to mitigate the risk to a level that we're comfortable proceeding. That's what they're looking for. Whether it's like that might translate to asking for a SOC 2 or an ISO, or it might translate to GDPR components, might translate to different acronyms and different methods or models that they use to figure that out. But essentially, that is the big loaded question that they're trying to get an answer for. And that person who's doing that attestation, they're writing a recommendation. The recommendation is not to go with the vendor or don't go with the vendor. The recommendation is here they're scoring your risk to the business, and then somebody else in the business is likely making the decision of, hey, is this worth it, or are we going to move to another vendor, or are we going to delay the project, or are we going to go back to the vendor and see if there's a willingness to maybe tip things up a little bit and bring things to a point where we're comfortable. But that is the ultimate question. That's the ultimate. They're scoring you with whatever model they've developed internally. They're scoring you on that basis. What risk are you bringing to them, and is it worth it?
Awesome, Darren. You mentioned in the previous slide that you're starting to see some KPIs related to compliance and security going or being asked from the board level. Can you share a little bit more about like what some of those KPIs are and just maybe how founders should be thinking about that?
Yeah, so generally what we're seeing is a dashboard of key KPIs. And that may be that again, like KPIs in general, it's going to be unique to your business. What we see commonly in startups is a dashboard that shows the most recent vulnerability scan in your application, the most recent and the score of that, and sometimes some remediation reporting. So we have a tool that's built into our platform that actually runs weekly scans on your application and records. It gives history on how long a vulnerability has been left. So that would show up in a board report. So it'd be like on the quarter, how many critical vulnerabilities are there? Okay, why is this critical vulnerability left, unpatched for 7 weeks or something like that? So that's an example of a KPI. There's often something like that around the application environment or the infrastructure environment. What we see a lot with our users, we have a report that can be generated from our application, shared with the board, that shows your compliance scoring. That includes everything from policy sign off to awareness training. And it just kind of gives a high level score, like where are we in our compliance? We're 83%, awesome. Okay, are we 42%? Probably not awesome. How's the team performing, from a human resource perspective on policy sign off and awareness training? So you have score points like that. So those are some of the scores that are generally being articulated to the board. And certainly to the CEO, like we recommend that the CEO looks at something once a month that just shows. Be surprised how many times we've gone into a meeting with one of our customers 8 months into their engagement with us and be like, you guys aren't doing really well. And it's like, what do you mean? Like, I thought our guys had, well, if you logged in, you'd see that, nobody signed off on the policies. So it's like, well, I've been operating I've been going around telling everybody we're compliant with GDPR. I'm like, well, from our standpoint, you're not, so you're lying. So, and we've seen that in some of our bigger customers. Like I had a customer recently, about 250 employees, and sat down with the CEO and was like, a little concerned about your score. He's like, what do you mean? Like, it's like all their marketing material saying they're compliant with X, Y, and Z, but in reality, under the hood, that's marketing. That's what marketing's saying, because somebody told marketing 8 months ago that we're compliant. But because that's not happening internally, it's essentially false marketing. It's a complete lie. And, what I see out there all the time now is if you say you're doing that, and that's something that's important to your customer, they're going to ask for validation. And if you can't validate, like if you're claiming your marketing, you're doing something and you don't have the ability to demonstrate in any way to them that it's real, then they're just going to start to like, it's the house of cards starts to collapse, because it's like, okay, what other bullshit are we talking about here? Like these guys are just saying whatever the hell they need to say to close a deal. What's actually going on under the hood, right? So, but yeah, those are some of the KPIs. It does depend on like what the scope of the business is, though. Like generally, less is more when it comes to the board. Like I don't want to. We've seen companies try to deliver like, here's a report on every security domain. That's usually a little too much unless you have somebody on the board that has the experience. Basically, just want to make sure, are we compliant with what we tell our customers? Or, another way to put it, are we doing the things we've signed agreements to do? Because you're not doing an enterprise deal anymore without having a security addendum or a security schedule within that. So, are you meeting the requirements, that the things that you've signed a contract with your customers that you're doing?
Perfect. Well, Darren, really appreciate you coming on to talk about this subject with all of our founders, and really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for the great questions, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.